Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on one sec. I just
National
want
Pornographic says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on one sec. I just
National
want
Pornographic says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on one sec. I just
National
want
Pornographic says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15
Are
what?
you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? So tonight I'm talking with TJump about why I think that Jesus probably didn't exist. I feel like I have a pretty solid position, on suggesting that you should doubt that Jesus existed in the past. So TJump and I, we are going to be talking about that. TJump stuff is all linked in the description, if you guys will. He produces a lot of great discussions and content in general. Definitely go over there and check out his channel. Be sure to subscribe if you want more information from TJump, more discussions. He does a lot of discussions and debates, so please go over there, check him out. Before we get in tonight, you're going to see right below me some stuff scrolling by. I did launch a new shirt that's a play off of Capturing Christianity. That's, by the way, evolution is a fact. Kind of themed up like Cameron does it. So I've got that down there. If you guys want to head over there and snag a shirt, it's btwevolutionisAfact.com. Just go check that out. I've got some other things rolling around down there too, if you want to go and check that out. With all of that out of the way, hey TJump, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you? Thanks for having me on, by the way.
Oh yeah, no problem, man. When we talked on the Magic Sandwich Show about, what was it, anti-realism and anti-realism as far as morality goes?
Moral realism versus anti-realism.
Right. Yeah. That's where we kind of first, I guess, interacted live on a stream, and then you were like, "Hey, I want to talk to a mythicist," and so I'm like, "Well, I'm a mythicist," and so yeah, that's how this came to be. So where I wanted to start off first tonight, though, is would you mind if I started off by asking you, like, why are you convinced that he definitely existed, or do you even use that kind of language when you're talking about it?
Well, I'd say he probably existed. Like, I think that I wouldn't ever go with definitely on anything, because I like to always caveat there's a probability, but it's always like highly likely or highly unlikely, the straight epistemology language. But yeah, so I think that Jesus existed because I think the evidence provided for Jesus is essentially equivalent for the evidence provided for most historical characters, or greater. So if we think that Socrates existed because it was written by Plato, or that he was mentioned by Plato, and that's about all we have, then I think it's reasonable to believe Jesus existed because he was mentioned by Paul or Josephus or Tacitus or all of the other historians who just mentioned him in passing. So it seems like most historical characters we have throughout history are essentially just, we think they existed because somebody else said they existed, and that's about it. We don't really have much, especially 2,000 years ago or before, for the existence of anybody except like really big figures like emperors and kings and people like that who actually did the writing. But most historical figures are just not very significant, and so most people never wrote about them. And so any kind of attestation of this person existed with this name or whatever is usually pretty reasonable to believe if they were a human, because there were just so many humans, and the fact that one of them had this particular name and had some traits that may have been embellished seems pretty likely. So I think that in the case of Jesus, the fact that we have testimony, lots of different testimony from different people, including like people who believed in him, but also people who didn't believe in him, or people who uh, talked to people who believed in him, seems like it's reasonable to believe that there was a guy named Jesus in the time period, because messiahs were pretty common back then. Being crucified was pretty common back then. Most of the stuff that happened to Jesus was pretty common and unremarkable, and the things that were described in his story seem very strange to think they'd make up a story where all this very contradictory, silly stuff happens. If they're going to make up a story, they'd probably make it up to be more consistent, more um, interesting, rather than just a guy who was a fisher and did some stuff and did the same miracles everyone else was doing at the same time period. And the whole thing about being born in Nazareth and Bethlehem, like if they would make it up, why not just have him be born in Bethlehem in the first place? Doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. They seem like they're trying to take the Jewish mythology and then trying to fit it into some guy who existed at some time period. And so it seems like it was likely that the Jesus guy existed as a human, and they were just trying to fit all of the Jewish stuff into that story, which is why there's so many inconsistencies in the testimony or the accounts of Jesus. But it seems like it's because of those inconsistencies, it's more likely he existed and was a guy, because if they just made it up, they wouldn't need to articulate or explain why those inconsistencies happened in the first place.
Okay, that's a really good start. So I've already got a few notes written down here. So first off, me personally, I think the only evidence that actually talks about Jesus like independently from everything else is Paul. So I think that is the one source in history, and Paul never references Jesus like being on earth, never references his ministry, and only talks about a celestial Jesus that he perceives through revelation and he reads about in Scripture. So, do you have any problems with that particular stance?
Well, I think he described Jesus as in like hearsay, where he heard about Jesus as a human being from other people, like the people around
Mm,
him.
well, sorry, I have a habit of doing that little thing, and I
It's all
need to
right.
stop. Well, he doesn't actually describe Jesus on Earth at all. Like he doesn't talk about Jesus's presence on Earth. He only talks about the revelation that he's gotten from Jesus. He also references other apostles only in the context of getting revelation from Jesus, not
Well, I
in
believe
knowing
he
them.
said he was crucified, so I think I mean, he did mention it was be crucified, so I think that kind of
Well,
entails him being on Earth.
well, not necessarily. There. Have you heard of the ascension of Isaiah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the earliest redaction of the ascension of Isaiah actually has Jesus descending from the upper heavens to the lower heavens to be crucified in the lower heavens by the devil and his demons. And actually, this is somewhat corroborated by Paul when Paul, and I want to say that it's in Galatians, one of his Galatians verses where he talks about Jesus being crucified by the archons of this aeon, which is a common term for Satan and demons that rule the earth. That's actually a pretty common theological thing in Christianity, is that Satan, well, I guess, and Judaism, is that Satan is the ruler of this physical world, and God is the ruler of the heavenly world. There's a lot of support for the fact that you didn't have to necessarily be on Earth, like in history, as as a person to be crucified, but also for Paul, what you have is basically it being revealed to him that this happened to Jesus, and that's not the same as having a historical source that says Jesus was crucified on earth by the Romans, you know?
As far as I know, I think that pretty much every mention of crucifixion by the Jews during the time period was specifically in reference to like Roman crucifixion. I don't know
Well,
of many who actually did talk about any other kind of crucifixion, because it would be strange to try and use that terminology, which is so well known. If you're talking to a certain demographic of people, they understand crucifixion to be the kind where you're like strung up by the Romans to be like humiliated and tortured. To use that same word for some other kind of use would be odd because it would be confusing, especially since that use really wasn't common at the time period.
Well, I mean, how much do you know about the history of crucifixion?
I have no idea. A little bit. I don't know.
Okay, so commonly prior to the Jesus time period and Christians kind of taking over history, basically, you had this set of like punishment, torture, execution methods, right? They were all under this one umbrella, and that would be suspension, right? These suspension tortures or executions, and even the Jews took part in this as well. Jews, whenever if you committed a crime severe enough, what they would do is they'd stone you, and then they would hang you either on a tree or on a wall or something like that. But anyways, they would pin you up crucifixion style and do that. Which also crucifixion, there's multiple different versions of crucifixion. There's the crux simplex, which is actually just a pole, and you're pretty much either nailed to the pole or the pole's rammed up your ass through your body, and that was a execution method. And so it evolved from that into the Roman crucifixion that we know now. But in any case, at that period of time, crucifixion was known to be the Roman type of crucifixion. But I would also contend that Paul, instead of saying archons of this aeon, which is very, I guess, ambiguous in this context, because you can't really tell if he's talking about the Romans or is he talking about the demons, because in Christian theology there exists a copy of things in the lower heavens. There's a copy of everything. So if it's occurring here on earth, then it would be occurring in the heavens too, or it would exist in the heavens, the lower heavens as well. Because in Christian theology and Jewish theology, there's actually 7 levels of heaven. So yeah, the crucifixion portion actually doesn't solidify that he was talking directly about the Romans, or that Jesus was crucified here on earth, because Paul completely separates himself from any kind of human testimony or any kind of testimony other than Jesus and God. He does that in Galatians 1:11, where he says that the gospel that I preach to you does not come from man, it comes from Jesus himself through revelation.
But I do remember most of his story being about humans and what's going on Earth, so it seems kind of out of place for him to have most of the story happening here on Earth, but then to mention this one place that happens to be in like the other realms. Like most of Paul's story is about what's going on here.
Most of Paul's stories about Jesus?
No, about Earth, like the stuff happening on Earth, not in heaven.
Well, I'm specifically talking about the content that's about Jesus, though.
Well, I mean, like the whole Gospels, everything he writes, most of the narratives of what he's writing is about his story and his transformation and his encounter with Jesus. But all of that seems to be happening here on Earth. He doesn't seem to be mentioning things that happened in other realms. So it would seem strange that he mentioned this one thing, this crucifixion, which is a very earthly term, and then applies in this one case to be a second realm, which he's never really mentioned before.
Well, that's because it was common in the Jewish and Christian theology that there were these different levels of heaven. And I mean, I showed you how there was at least another Jewish sect or technically Jewish Christian sect at the time that had the idea of Jesus descending from the upper heavens to the lower heavens, never descending to earth, and being crucified in the lower heavens by the devil. So it would be fallacious to say that there was just nobody in the first century around the time of Paul that was teaching that, because the ascension of Isaiah dates to the first century.
Yeah, but do we have any reason to believe that Paul actually believed that?
Well, I mean, it doesn't exactly. I get that it does matter, and we don't have any direct evidence that Paul was influenced by the ascension of Isaiah. But what we do have is that Paul does mention the different levels of heaven. And when he talks about archons of this aeon, the rulers of this world, he instead of saying the Romans, he could have just said, or instead of saying the Romans, he chose that particular phrase that is more commonly used to denote the devil and his demons.
What do you mean more commonly used to denote the devil and his demons? Because as far as I know, that term isn't really very commonly used at all. It's just kind of like an archaic choice of terminology.
Well, I'm talking about it at that time period when they used archons of this aeon in this particular context that he's talking in. It was about demons and the devil that ruled, this world. I mean, that's pretty common in Christian and Jewish theology.
Pretty common. Like, do you have examples of where they actually use that terminology in any reference to anything other than like just?
Well, I mean, I don't have any on me, but I can look that up afterwards, the specifics on that, and get it to you. I do know that, I mean, this particular part of my evidence is based on Richard Carrier's work, which however you feel about him. But he's been the one to dive pretty deep into the ascension of Isaiah, looking at the history of that and all of that, but it ties into the whole archons of this aeon and this entire situation right here. So let's see. Let's move past that though. That particular part. So where do you think that Paul got his information from humans here on Earth?
Part of it, yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of it came from other stories that he pieced together from other people. I don't think he just envisioned it in all in his head on his own. I think it did because it does correspond a lot to the other stories and other testimonies of other historians who mention things that other Christians talked about.
Wait, what specifically are we talking about? Is because nothing in Paul corroborates the Gospels other than Jesus.
Right. So I mean, but the fact that he's mentioned him and the kind of things that he talks about are not really like, it's not like a different kind of Jesus, not like Jesus is a separate person or that there's some massive differences, or they seem to corroborate each other. They seem to fit, like all the different attestations of Jesus, not only from Paul but from other kinds of historians like Josephus and Tacitus just mention him, all seem to fit this story.
Well, okay, so what can you tell me about? Let's start with Tacitus because that's a little bit easier. What can you tell me about Tacitus?
You just mentioned that some Christians existed and they believed in this guy named Jesus.
You don't know any other I guess technical information about Tacitus?
No, I don't have it memorized. No.
Oh no, I wasn't asking you for it to be memorized or anything like that. I didn't want to come off as condescending, and tell you things that you already knew. But so here's my argument against Tacitus. Okay, so Tacitus has been forensically studied in. I can't say the university's name. It's in Italy. I can get you the information later. But it's been forensically identified as it not actually saying Christus, but it actually says Christus in both of the locations where in Tacitus it talks about it. So that's been forensically identified as not saying Christus, but Christus. Now, so Tacitus, what was happening with him was he was writing in the 2nd century. By the 2nd century, you had the Christian religion that had been well established. You have, by the time Tacitus was writing, that would have been at least 3 Gospels that were in circulation and were widely known by Christians. So the fact that he attests to Christians in Rome in 64 AD doesn't really solidify anything about Jesus being in history. I mean, all that does is talk about Christians being in Rome in 64 AD. The side information of Tacitus that it can be removed, and the rest of the passage reads fine. So that's one argument for the interpolation of Tacitus. Another thing is what's that Harry Potter villain name? Sulpicius Severus in the 4th century. He's the first one to actually reference the Tacitus passage in reference to like Christ or Christians. So that particular reference doesn't crop up until then. We have a number of different things that were written before that time that should have referenced Tacitus and Nero's blaming of the Christians for the burning of Rome. There are a number of things that where that should have been mentioned. But in any case, all that said, like all Tacitus says, is that there were Christians in Rome in 64 for the burning of Rome, and Nero blamed them, even though he's the only one that records that. Everybody else records something completely different about who Nero blamed for it. And the even if we took the part that talks about Christ and being crucified by Pilate and all that, if we took that as at face value, being that Tacitus wrote it, then he most likely would have been informed by Pliny the Younger, who was just in the next country over. He was interrogating Christians. He knew about Christian theology. He was also pen pals with Tacitus, so he could have informed Tacitus about the beliefs of Christians, and then Tacitus could have written that in there, only knowing what Christians knew in the 2nd century. So he doesn't cite any kind of reference that would place him as independent from the gospel message or anything like that.
Well, sure, but so as far as I know, that the consensus on Tacitus that he is talking about Christ. I don't know about the study you mentioned about the university in Italy, but I'm pretty sure most historians think he is in fact talking about Christ.
Okay, well, so Christ is not actually a name. That's a title, for
Right.
one. So Christus is actually a name. And so that main difference there kind of indicates that. But regardless of whether or not you think that this was referencing Christ, there is the part in it that talks directly about things that are only in the Gospels.
No, it doesn't actually talk about anything in the Gospels, right?
Yeah, it does.
It does?
The only place where Christ is crucified by Pilate, the only place that exists is in the Gospels.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And so Tacitus being writing in the 2nd century, he was just regurgitating what Christians believed at that time. And at that time, Christ being crucified by Pilate would have been a main part of their theology, right?
Right, but if it was invented by Paul, then it would seem strange that they all interpreted it that way, right?
If
So like you're saying that Jesus never existed, so all of this was invented somehow.
Well, I'm saying that Jesus never walked on earth, like he never existed in history, but I believe that Jesus is prophesized, like the Messiah, not specifically Jesus a person, but the Messiah figure of Judaism is predicted in the Old Testament. And then what you have is 1st century Jews that were reading the Old Testament, expecting a Messiah to come. The Messiah doesn't come, and then they start like hallucinating this Jesus character. They had been poring over the Old Testament, studying all these things. You have multiple groups that are popping up, having different opinions about things. That's why you have like the 2 different genealogies in the Gospels. You have the varying different ways that Jesus was born. In Matthew, it directly parallels, Moses's birth, and in Luke, he interprets different scriptures to mean different things, and so he has to come up with a way for Jesus to be born in one place and then travel and be born in Bethlehem, right?
Well, if we accept that story, then how did they get to this idea that Jesus was crucified? Because there are no clear testaments in the Old Testament that actually say the Messiah is going to be crucified or resurrect from the dead. That's not part of it. To quote Michael Kona, it's just a quote from him.
Oh, okay. I've actually got a really good video on my channel where I respond to Capturing Christianity, talking about how they weren't expecting a crucified Messiah. They definitely were expecting like some kind of disgraced and killed Messiah. That's from Old Testament scriptures that you can look up. And we know for a fact that they were looking to the scriptures for information about Jesus. So that would be Paul's Pauline Creed. It's 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, where he talks about how Christ died according to the scriptures. He's talking about where he got his information from, in the scriptures. So not only that, but we also have Philo of Alexandria, who references the book of Zechariah, where it talks about a Messiah figure that is going to raise up and absolve sins and all this other stuff, and sit at the right hand of the Father and everything like that. And Philo was actually a contemporary of Paul, who was writing just a little bit before Paul. And so what you have there is just Paul went one direction while Philo goes kind of another direction with it, along with the other Jews, because the Jews also came up with a similar Messiah story, except they have twin Messiahs. Basically, they end up with two Messiahs, Messiah ben Joseph and a Messiah ben David. Ben Joseph is the one that dies, and then Ben David is the one that resurrects Joseph so that he can absolve the sins of the Jewish people. So really, you just have to combine those two figures into one person in order to get the Christian theology.
Well, so you're saying they've created these two narratives split apart into two different demographics of Christianity, and then those two narratives are actually combined later and conjoined into one narrative.
No. What I'm saying is that there's a Messiah narrative in the Old Testament, right? And the Jews interpreted that to be the two different Messiahs. And then the Christians, what would become the Christians, just merged that two Messiah idea into one, and you have Jesus.
Okay, and so you're saying that all of this happened, and it was just invented by some of the early Jews, and there was no guy named Jesus, and so why would they do all of this? Because it seems most of the story they do describe in like the Gospels does seem to have things like the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, but he's not. He's born in Nazareth, or vice versa. Like, why would they make that up? Like, how did that come about? If they're just making up a story, and the Jesus in the Old Testament is, or the Messiah in the Old Testament is prophesied to be born in Bethlehem, why not just have him born in Bethlehem?
Well, because of how they interpreted the scriptures. They interpreted the scriptures with him being like one nationality, but then being prophesized as being born in another place. Like I believe, let's see, what is it? They refer to him as the branch, which is supposed to allude to him being from Nazareth. Is one particular thing. Now in Matthew. What they have is they have him being born in Bethlehem, and then they leave and go to Egypt and then come back. That's a direct mirror of Moses.
Yeah, but wasn't he born in Nazareth? Like, why? Where does that connection come from?
Well, I told you the scriptures. I mean, the scriptures.
So you're saying they like interpreted the Old Testament wrong? They got it wrong, and then they interpreted it or they interpreted it one way, and then they interpreted it a different way, and they had to try and make the story match their second interpretation?
Well, no. I mean, are you under the idea that there was just one group that was Christians in the first century?
No, there's many of them, of course. Like,
well, right. So there's many different groups of Christians in the first century. I mean, if you look at the Nag Hammadi library, you have several different references there to different versions of the same Christ character. Did you know, Tom? You're going to like this. Did you know that there's a version of Christ who takes Mary up on a mountain, and looking her directly in the face, he pulls out a copy of another woman, fucks her, shoots his load inside her, and then reaches inside, pulls out his load and eats it, looks her dead in the face, and says, "Do this in remembrance of me." I mean, they believed a lot of different things at that time. If you doubt me on that, just look up Bart Ehrman. I forgot which book that's in. One of Bart Ehrman's books, where he's talking about the different Jesuses that were supposed to that people supposedly believed in. He talks about that being in one of these manuscripts. So, so there were a wide range of different Jewish Christians at the time. They were all interpreting these old scriptures differently, and it's not so much they were inventing, like it wasn't like an invention, right? Because invention kind of seems like it's something made out of nothing, right? Or made up out of whole cloth. But what they were doing was they were taking existing Jewish theology and trying to figure out, as a matter of their faith, what to expect from Jesus. And then instead of Jesus actually coming, they assumed that that he already came and he absolved their sins, and then they started hallucinating him, right? Because, I mean, you don't think that celestial Jesus actually revealed himself to Paul, right?
No, but I would think that the idea that they hallucinated him just based off of a conception they made up in their head is far less likely than like a bereavement delusion where they had an experience of some person who they were really like enthralled with, and then that person died, and then they started to have hallucinations like most people, because bereavement delusions are really common. If you have a loved one, you die, and you can see them after or hear them after, and you have really vivid experiences of experiencing them after their death, and that's a common thing that we know of. Whereas hallucinating someone you've just envisioned in your head based off of other kinds of older texts doesn't really happen that much. That's not really a common thing.
Well, I mean, so the fact is that Paul says that Jesus, told him all of this stuff through revelation, right? Paul never met this Jesus person. They didn't have Polaroids back then. They couldn't take pictures of him. So it's not like they knew like what he looked like and all this other stuff. They didn't draw a picture of Jesus, right? But since Paul never met him, how could he envision somebody that he never met, never saw, he only heard about?
Well, didn't he hear about him through torturing Christians who told him most likely?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, he was torturing Christians, or he was killing Christians. He was persecuting the church, is what he says. So, but my point is that Paul didn't have a connection like to Jesus, like you're suggesting. Like I could understand that for anybody that supposedly knew Jesus in his life, right? But we don't have evidence that anybody knew Jesus during his life.
Well, doesn't Paul specifically mention that he went to go see like the brother James, the brother of Jesus?
So that particular passage, if you look at the Greek, it's actually ambiguous, so it doesn't really help either my case or your case. But the language there is used to indicate either a blood relationship to the person or a fictive kinship through like a cult or religion, right? That those are both of the meanings that are used right there. And if you look up other uses of it, you'll see that it's used in either case, so it's actually kind of ambiguous. But one thing that helps my side of this is that Paul has this theology of brothers of the Lord, right? So there were anybody that was a baptized Christian was considered a brother of the Lord. He says this multiple times in his writings, that anybody who believes in Christ, who lives in Christ, who's reborn through Christ, is also a brother of the Lord, a brother and sister. So unless you want to say that everybody that he refers to is a brother of Christ or a sister, even when Paul is talking about bringing sisters with him, or apostles bringing sisters with them as their wives on mission trips and to go and preach, unless you mean that they're literal sisters there, which I'm not going to rule out sister fucking in first century Judea, but I'm just saying that it's kind of inconsistent to take that one particular passage as meaning a blood brother when you have all these other passages that seem to contradict the specific use of that phrase as being a blood brother.
Well, even if we do interpret it as like a same kind of a like follower kind of relationship, the fact that he went to go meet these two guys who supposedly knew Jesus seems to be kind of like indicative of the fact, regardless of whether or not they were literal brothers, that there was a guy named Jesus there.
Well, no. Because Paul never suggests that they knew Jesus. He only says that one of them was an apostle and the other one was just a general Christian.
Right, but like apostle, doesn't apostle mean one of the apostles who were specifically working with Jesus? Not just anybody could be an apostle.
No. Not anybody could be an apostle. To be an apostle, and Paul lays this out specifically in all of his work, is that to be an apostle, you just had to have had a revelation of Jesus. Having a revelation of Jesus is very different from knowing Jesus in real life, wouldn't you say?
Sure, but as far as I know, he's the only one who had that. Like all the other apostles were supposedly knew him.
No.
Like because there are lots of people who claim to have revelations of Jesus. That's a really common thing, especially at the time period. Most of them did not claim to be apostles.
Wait, name another person that was writing that claimed to be an apostle.
I don't know if they're well, yeah, none of them claim to be apostles, but the whole idea that, like you mentioned, that people would have visions of Jesus, that's a
Right.
really common thing if you would be a religious person and believe in Jesus, potentially.
Right.
But they wouldn't all just be apostles because they had a vision of Jesus.
That's the only criteria that Paul states in his writings. When he talks about the which I think it's actually, let's see, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, I believe is where it says it. Hold on, let me see if I can pull this up real quick. Yes, so at the very end of that, he says, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Now, he's talking about James, like the just, one of the pillars of Christianity, who was an apostle at that point, right? And to all the other apostles. Apostle just means that he received revelation of Jesus. Now, that was the only way that you could be an apostle, but he also doesn't talk about how there were other people claiming to be apostles, to be preaching from a revealed Jesus. I do believe there's another passage. Oh, what is it? Maybe it's in Galatia. I think it might have been one of the Galatians. It might have been Galatians 2, where he talks about how people were preaching other Jesuses. Like these other people are preaching these other Jesuses, but the one that I revealed to you is the true one. He goes around and he tells them that. So there definitely were plenty of people going around claiming to have visions of Jesus, claiming to be preaching this gospel. And Paul was like, no. They're not legit. I'm legit. And these other guys, they're legit. In Galatians 2, I know he comes back to Jerusalem to confirm the gospel that he was preaching with the other people he considered to be true apostles of Jesus. But the key point here, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, is the fact that he never identifies anybody as a disciple. An apostle does not mean disciple.
From my understanding, I think it's pretty much accepted by the consensus that the apostles knew Jesus, that James was the brother of Jesus, that they literally did meet him, except with the exception of Peter, which it would make sense why he would change the definition of apostle to be only being like someone who saw a vision, because that's all he could experience.
Well,
but
yeah,
it
but
seems like go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm chomping at the bits, but sorry.
Yeah, so it seems like the consensus shows that yes, there are lots of multiple attestations, and these guys did exist, and there was probably a Jesus. Like the vast majority of historians seem to agree on this, and that the historical mention of him is pretty reliable in sight of what history counts as evidence. So it seems like the description you're giving of the story is possible. I absolutely agree it's possible, but it seems highly unlikely. Like the amount of things that would have to go right for that to occur are exceedingly improbable, as opposed to just there was a guy named Jesus who people believed in and they worshiped him and then added the stories later. That's far more likely. It happens a lot all throughout human history. But the idea of making up a character from a non-existent person, no human existed, and just creating a story behind that, which is then gains the traction that Jesus did, is far more unlikely. It's possible, but unlikely.
So, but still, you haven't actually pointed out, which I want to say about the consensus. I don't like the consensus argument one bit. Okay, not because it's against my position, but because it doesn't actually prove anything. Right? You could cite the consensus all day. It doesn't mean that they're right. I mean, the consensus, prior to germ theory was, spirits and ghosts and all this other stuff. That was a consensus then, and then it got overturned. Just like, which I don't know, you might consider Moses to be a real person?
No.
I'm guessing?
No.
Oh, that's interesting. Why don't you consider Moses to be a real person?
Because there's essentially no recorded anything of him by anyone ever.
Oh,
No near
that's weird.
testimony. No, there's nothing written about him anywhere near his lifespan by anyone who knew him, or knew the people who knew him, or knew the people who knew the people who knew the people who knew him, until like hundreds of years, thousands of years later. Like it's just
Well, you understand that Paul is the only independent account for Jesus, and he doesn't even mention him being on Earth. Which, of course, I get you disagree with that particular thing. So I guess we can move on from that. But
well, I still think like the other sources that wrote the Gospels, like the Q source and the P source, do count as even indirect evidence of the existence of Jesus. Like I don't think
it's weird that you mentioned the Q source, because you know that's not an actual source, right?
what do you mean it's not an actual source? It's just
It's
the label
not.
given to an unknown author.
It's well, no, it's a label for things that people have hypothesized as being in the quote unquote Q source. But I don't know if you really have time at all. I know I barely have enough time. If you read Mark Goodacre's what is it, Doubting Q or something like that, I think it's titled. There's no real Q source. That's not a physical thing that we have. It's a hypothetical. So it's not a real source, as in it's not a tangential source, right?
Right. It was like one of the documents that was used to write the other documents
Well,
that we don't have anymore, something like that.
Well, it's hypothesized to be a document that informed other documents, but I would contest that you can't really distinguish Q from Mark.
That would be an interesting position to hold. I don't
Really,
know why.
if you want to cite like consensuses and scholars and stuff, Mark Goodacre's on that particular train, as well as other scholars out there. They're on that particular train too. So it's not so far-reaching, because there's nothing that's hypothesized to be in Q that would not also be in Mark. So you can't really distinguish the two.
I would have to just go with the consensus on that one. I think that the consensus is, yeah, you can. There is, the Q source is a pretty well established thing in the historical community. But I do think the consensus is an important thing to focus on. You're right, the consensus can be wrong, like in the context of the germ theory, but the consensus in the academic fields tends to follow the evidence wherever it leads. They don't usually.
Maybe. Can you tell me about the makeup of the consensus? Like, as far as who are scholars? Like, if you had to give like a percentage, how many of those scholars are like atheists or secular in general?
The majority, don't know exactly, but the majority.
No. The majority is definitely not, like, it's definitely less than the majority. The majority of New Testament scholars and scholars in this field are in fact Christians. So you're basically hearing
just historians of the New Testament. I'm talking about historians in general, like all historians.
Okay, see, I was talking about historians that would have training in the field of like New Testament criticism, New Testament studies, not just a guy, that is a total nerd on the Civil War. Like, him having an opinion on New Testament studies as far as like whether or not Jesus existed, or whether the Q source is a real thing, or anything like that. Like that would be an argument from false authority, like using those particular scholars. I'm talking about scholars that are in the field of New Testament studies, like Gary Habermas, Mike Licona. Did you know Mike Licona was actually fired from a job because he doubted the historicity of zombies walking around in Jerusalem?
Right, the ones that revived after the resurrection of Jesus.
Right, he got fired from his job for that.
Well, even just talking about historians who are qualified in those documents, like even historians who study the Greek and all of the different the documents of that time period, the most would still be non-religious. Specifically the ones who specifically study the New Testament alone would be religious, but historians who study the documents of the time period would still be mostly non-religious.
Okay. I would really like to see your evidence on that, because if you look at David Fitzgerald's first book of Jesus, Mything in Action, he actually does a study on people in the field, in this particular field, and the institutions that you go to, that you're accredited by, are all Christian institutions. Like, you have to be a Christian in order to go to those institutions. So those are the people that are certifying the historians that are coming up with the consensus. I mean, it would be a lot like getting your information from Ken Ham about the consensus of how the Earth formed, and saying that, oh, well, that Trump shit over here, because he's got all these scientists and everything like that have relevant degrees in their fields, and they all have a consensus on how the Earth was formed. I'm just saying that consensus is not a good way to argue a point. And so that's why I try not to argue like from consensus. I try to argue from the actual evidence. Like, for instance, with Tacitus, you're saying that Tacitus is proof that Jesus existed. Well, Robert Van Voorst, who's a Christian historian, would wholly disagree with you on that. He analyzes it along with R.T. France. He mentions him in his book, where they talk about how you can't solidly say with enough certainty to be sure, like more than 50% or more than however much you want to place on it, that he's an independent author that attests to Jesus, like, because he was obviously influenced by the Christian thinking of the 2nd century. So there are plenty of Christians in the mainstream that disagree with a number of the sources. Alice Wheely, she disagrees about the whole redacted version of Josephus, the Testimonium Flavianum. She's a Christian. She actually was able to trace the Testimonium Flavianum that we find in the Syriac and Arabic versions, that seems to be redacted and present a more Jewish version of, like, a reference to Jesus. Those all trace back to the Eusebius document from the 3rd century. And so you can't say that particular, like, evidence, the testimonium, existed before Eusebius got his hands on it. Well, it's either Eusebius or Eusebius's mentor. Either one of them inserted that whole cloth into Josephus, and you can't actually establish that a redacted version existed before that, because any evidence of a redacted version before that it actually just stems from Eusebius's already altered version.
Well, I wanted to go back to what you said earlier. Like, from my understanding, the Fitzgerald thing is only specifically about scholars related to the Bible. Like, people who specifically study the Bible are mostly Christians, but historians, like, are in the same field and study the same, like, documents of the Bible, but other stuff as well, are mostly atheists. Like, I mean, to quote Mike Licona, most biblical scholars and historians hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside the bounds of historian acting within their professional capacity. So most of the consensus is a reliable source of data. It's the most reliable, actually.
Did you really just reference Mike Licona?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, you realize that Mike Licona thinks Jesus rose from the dead, right?
Yeah, he's a Christian.
Yes, he is. And so you have a Christian historian that's telling you that most people are atheists or secularists that study these things, and they agree with me, the Christian, about it. Like, I mean,
what?
Not about the resurrection, about the about what Mike Licona is saying. Mike Licona or Gary Habermas won't actually release those lists that they say that they have.
Well, this was from his paper, Historians and Miracle Claims, where he's arguing that miracles should be accepted. And he's just mentioning in the first line is that most historians and biblical scholars don't accept this. They disagree with me.
Well, okay, so in that particular context, then I would probably agree, because miracles, I mean, that's a wholly different context than what we're talking about right here.
How so? Because we're talking about, like...
Because you could be Christian and accept that, and accept that miracles don't provide the proof that you would need to say something, happened in history.
Well, no, it's that historians don't accept that miracles can be assessed through history.
Yeah, you could still be a Christian and come to that conclusion.
From the best of my knowledge, most even Christian historians usually think that yes, you can usually assess miracle claims through history. I don't know what you're referencing there. It seems like many of them, that seems to be the consensus in the Christian historians, that they do accept miracle claims are justifiable through historical documents.
No, I mean, I wholly disagree with your assessment of like like the makeup of the historians. And I'm sorry, but I really don't trust Mike Lacona as being able to present that, just because of how, not because of who he is, but because of how he twists a lot of his evidence in order to make it fit for him. And if he's arguing for miracles in that particular instance, I mean, he's already going to be twisting information, or at least have a skewed like perception of it, I guess. So I would rather see hard data than hear an opinion of Mike Lacona, right?
Well, how about Bart Ehrman? Do you trust him? Because he said the same thing.
Well, it's not, at this point. It's not about trusting like who it came from or whatnot. It's about seeing the actual information, seeing the actual numbers. Because in the studies that I've seen, like most notably from David Fitzgerald, talking to institutions out there that that have New Testament studies and all that, they are mostly Christian. Like if they're not, if they didn't directly say that they require you to be Christian, they just simply didn't answer you.
Do you have
Answer
a reference to that?
the
'Cause
study.
from my understanding, a lot of those actually come from Jews. Jews actually studied a lot even more than Christians do.
Oh, okay. Like I said, I don't know exactly. I do know the one study that I saw where it has a majority of institutions that train these biblical scholars as being Christian institutions that are training them up in ways that Christians do history. Because the way that Christians do history on this particular subject is very different from how you do it in other historical rigor, in other historical contexts.
Oh, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I don't trust the Christian historians at all.
Wait, but then why do you trust the consensus? If you don't trust the Christian historians, why do you trust the consensus? Oh, because
the consensus is a separation. It's the majority non-Christians is the consensus. The consensus isn't majority Christians.
No. In this particular instance, like the majority, I would probably like the majority consensus. What's the majority consensus on the resurrection?
That it didn't happen.
Okay, and I'm guessing that's because of this whole majority secular bias against it, I guess.
Well, no, it's just most historians think that miracles aren't establishable by historical claims. Like any historical claim for miracles are just not even something historians can assess.
Okay. Well, maybe we should move on from this point because it doesn't really seem to be getting us anywhere. My point here is that consensus doesn't really tell us anything about the actual evidence underlying it, because the consensus can be wrong and built on faulty evidence, or at least faulty reasoning on the evidence. So that's why I prefer to look at the actual evidence that's there. And
I mean, in part I agree with you, but that's a really important point that I like to bring up, is that the consensus is the most reliable interpretation of the evidence. Like if you look at the evidence and your personal interpretation is more likely to be wrong than the consensus. The consensus can be wrong, like in the case of big shifts in knowledge when we have no evidence, then we get some new evidence and new discovery. Of course, it's going to be wrong until we verify the new discovery, and then the consensus is going to shift to agree with the new discovery. But we don't have any new discoveries that indicate that Jesus was just a fictional character. All of the evidence seems to indicate he was probably real in the majority of the case. I mean, we can always explain it in different ways, but the kind of things that would need to occur for those explanations to take place, and that every mention of Jesus was tampered with in some way, like you mentioned, added in from the Eusebius documents or his mentor or whatever, that's super like improbable. That's like saying that all of the mentions of Caesar were just modified in by someone else who never mentioned, or all of the mentions of Socrates were just modified in and added in by some third party. Like, it doesn't seem very plausible to
No,
me. It
I
seems
didn't
more
say any
likely
of that.
there was a guy named Jesus who people worshipped and he was crucified. I mean, all that seems pretty mundane to accept, and to try
So
and like say it doesn't exist and explain it away seems very implausible to me.
So did I say that references to Socrates were inserted? Did I say any of those things?
Well, no, I was comparing it, saying to say that all the mentions of Jesus were inserted would be like saying all the mentions of Socrates were inserted. I was making a comparison there.
Well, I say that I do say that most of the early references to Jesus were inserted, like the Tacitus reference and the Josephus reference. But I just find it odd because, like, Eusebius is known for editing his own church history to be false at a number of times. He's known to edit things in his in his control multiple times in his career. He's known to be a liar. He's known to forge things for his own gain. How is it out of the realm of possibility, or how is it so improbable that this guy created something and inserted it into Josephus? So let's just play off of this for a second. If he did insert it into Josephus, what do you think that we would find, like in history?
I'm not sure. I've never thought about that.
Okay. Well, would you agree? Would you agree that we wouldn't find any references to this prior to Eusebius?
Yes.
Would you agree that we would only find references to it after Eusebius?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that the context of that particular passage would seem to be out of place wherever it was put because Josephus didn't write it?
Probably, yes.
Okay. Would you agree that the way that it was written would not be indicative of Josephus's writing?
Sure.
Okay. Do you think that given all of those points, we have at least made it not so improbable?
Well, no, I think the consensus is that it was him. So, I mean, again, I think that, is it possible? Yes, it's absolutely possible, but it's far less possible than it just being that's just what he wrote.
Okay, so it wouldn't matter to you that handwriting analysis or language analysis has been done on that particular passage and shows that, like, verbs are used completely differently than Josephus actually uses verbs. That there is no redacted version of that particular passage in in history. There's no reference to this passage before Eusebius. There's only references to it after Eusebius. So it seems like all of my points have been hit as far as what we would see. So you're only citing consensus here. Like, oh, a bunch of these Christians say that, yes, this definitely is a reference to Jesus. Therefore, it is a reference to Jesus.
Well, again, so I'm going with the consensus, including all of the atheists and the majority of non-Christians who also agree that the document seems legit.
Well, yeah, but we haven't actually established that the majority of them are actually atheists. All you have are anecdotal opinions from Bart Ehrman, Mike Licona, both people who have horrible arguments on this particular point. If you want to look at Raphael Lataster, he totally lambasts Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist book, talks about how it is very different in quality compared to the other books surrounding that he wrote. And then you've got, like, Mike Licona, who definitely twists the historical information that includes historical information that actually isn't historical. Like, all of the Gospels being written by the titled authors. I mean, do you think they were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. So I don't understand why you would take a shitty historian like Mike Licona and be like, oh, he's definitely right on this point, even though he's totally fucking wrong on all of this other shit.
Well, he's just admitting that the majority disagree with his position in that statement.
Oh, and he cites evidence for that?
Statement. What?
He cites evidence for that then.
Yes, he lists a bunch of the historians and then gives quotes of them in his document.
Well, I mean, he lists a bunch of historians, which I'm guessing a bunch is maybe like, what, 5?
I think it was like 20 or something. I don't know.
He lists 20 in his book? There
Yeah,
are
like
there are 20
listing-
New Testament historians.
What? No, 20 like historians who do research in the field who assess evidence in this way.
Okay.
So it's not specifically about the New Testament. It's just miracles in general applied to any kind of historical document.
Okay. Well, that like listing quotes from certain like scholars isn't exactly a study done on the field of historiography that shows that a majority of them are.
Right. I don't think that's like specifically been done. I'm pretty sure it's just
Well,
known
right.
in the methodology of history. That's
Well,
pretty
how
much
can it be? Well, hold on. How can it be known in the method of historiography or in history? How can that be a known if nobody's actually looked for it?
it's kind of like how we know that most people, most scientists believe the world is round, even though we haven't actually polled to ask how many scientists believe the world is round.
Well, I mean, that's because we've known that the world is a spherical, an oblate spheroid since the 6th century BCE. Even during the time when people were said to have thought that the Earth was flat, they actually knew about the spherical Earth. So that's a long established like fact. We don't have to
Right.
go and poll scientists about it. But in historiography, you yourself have even said that the bar is set really low, right?
Right, but that's the thing, in that in history, the miracles have not been seen as being able to be assessed by history for a very long time. Like just like known that the world is round. Like any testimony of saying that someone rose from the dead or that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus who were raised by a wolf, we don't take those seriously. Like it doesn't matter what the testimony is, we don't take those seriously because they're not within the realm of what history can adjudicate as true. Like anything about miracles or magic or mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, none of that stuff we take seriously in history, which has been known for a very long time.
Right. Well, I mean, so basically, you don't think that like Romulus and Remus were real people just because the consensus says they weren't real people?
Well, I'd say they weren't raised by a wolf for sure.
Oh, okay.
Probably they wouldn't. Probably didn't. I don't know if they existed or not. I haven't studied it enough to know about that.
Okay. What about Zeus?
No, probably not.
Well, I mean, there were like they were like Zeus. The other Olympians were thought to be real people at one time that just took on godlike status like later. So
Yeah, I can definitely see that's a possibility for sure. But I would say that because that happened over such a long period of time, and it wasn't just like where Jesus happened in 40 years later, he became a god or a perceived god. I think that's more likely to be an actual human than a Zeus person who happened over thousands of years, where they kind of just interpreted it into a larger
okay.
story.
Well, to provide a comparable, more recent thing, do you think aliens actually crash landed in Roswell?
No,
Okay, well, 30 years later, after that supposedly happened, you had supposedly over 100 witnesses that saw a UFO crash and saw the U.S. government take out alien bodies. So why is that not real then?
well, the
I mean,
aliens
it's
would be like the mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural thing. It's like if they said they saw a unicorn that crash landed on Earth, it'd still also not be reasonable because it's one of those things. If they said they saw a guy and there was just a guy who was sitting there and he was carted away by the government and crucified or imprisoned by the government, they'd be like, yeah, that's probably, I can say that happened. Yeah, that's probably true. So something as mundane as there was a guy, his name was Jesus, he was a Jew, he claimed to be God, and he was crucified. Like all of those things seem really, really plausible. Like saying, last Tuesday I saw a dog. I mean, it's such a simple claim that's so common that happens all the time in that time period that there's saying that it was all fabricated or added in later seems very unlikely. Like if I like saying that I made up the story about the dog I saw last Tuesday, like with that much evidence and those many different people saying that, well, we account that this happened, or that there are different kinds of things that this happened in relation to, and they're there, it seems unlikely to say it's also all just made up. It seems really hard for me to believe that.
okay. Have you ever heard of a guy named Ned Ludd?
No.
No? Okay, well, just because I'm a total shill, I'm bringing up my Crestus app right now. It's an app that I do for this particular conversation specifically. And let's see, I'm going to, was it other arguments? Ah, crap. I need to work on making shit more more finder friendly. But basically, Ned Ludd.
Could you put a link like in the description for it?
Oh yeah, there's one in there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's on both the iOS store, and it's on Android as well. But basically, it was said that Ned Ludd started this one religious movement. He did some things, and then a whole religious movement brought up around Ned Ludd, right? Do you think that Ned Ludd was a real person? People were talking about him, saying that he did a bunch of stuff.
I have no idea. I've never heard of Ned Ludd, but I would assume so, just based off of this.
Okay, well, Ned Ludd definitely did not exist. He's one of those particular things. It's like the cargo cults with John Frum. Nobody named John Frum visited these islands, but yet an entire religion popped up around the idea of John Frum. Right. The same thing happened with what was it, Prince? Oh, what? It's one of the princes during World War II. Anyways, they were trying to get the one of the princes from England to like come back to their island, even though he had never been there. So, I mean, to say that like people can't make these things up in such a short amount of time, or they can't do these things, I would think that you would need evidence to suggest that they can't do those things. And it seems
I was saying that the reason I believe that Jesus was a real guy as opposed to Zeus, or the reason I would say that it would be more reasonable to believe that Zeus was just a complete mythical character than Jesus, was because of the fact that the Zeus story was developed over thousands of years. It wasn't just based off of a singular character like that in that short period of time.
It was I don't know like how long it took for the mythology of Greece and Rome to develop, but I mean, did it take thousands of years for it to develop? Like, is there like solid evidence in history that it took 1,000 years, or are you just anecdotally saying it took thousands of years?
Well, it was always developing and changing over the thousands of years. I'm not sure what point we're measuring here. Like,
well, it would have to be the point, it not necessarily where it ended up, but just the point where this mythology was thought to be real.
Well, like when a guy who could do amazing things became supernatural, I think would be like, when did that happen? That would be like the point. I have no idea exactly when that happened, but if it started as a guy, just a random guy, and then the story was embellished over time to add that in,
okay,
that's possible. But if it was just a narrative fiction, it could have happened much easier over a shorter period of time.
Okay, so we can move on from because we did spend a lot of time, and we're coming up on just a little bit over an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time tonight, but do you mind if I rattle off a few key points and see if you can determine who I'm talking about?
Sure.
Okay. So, guy named Jesus, right? Okay. He came to Jerusalem during a religious ritual. He entered the temple to rant against the temple. He quoted a chapter of Jeremiah while in the temple. He preached daily. He declared woe unto the Jews. He predicted that the temple would be destroyed. He was arrested by the Jews for this prediction and for speaking against the temple. He was accused of speaking against the temple. He didn't defend himself against these accusations. He was beaten by the Jews. He was taken to the Roman governor. He was interrogated by the Roman governor. He was asked to identify himself. He doesn't identify himself. He doesn't say anything in his defense. They're beaten, or he's beaten by the Romans. The Roman governor decides to release him, except he either is or he isn't. And then he's killed by the Romans. and then he lamented for himself before he died, and he died with a loud cry. Now, who am I talking about?
You said you were talking about Jesus in the first line, right? Or did I miss something here?
Well, that was his name. So are you saying that we're talking about the Jesus of the Gospels?
Well, then most of that happened many times over history, so it could have been. That's one of the cases.
Okay. Well, my point here is that this was actually the story of Jesus Ben Ananias, who has an exact skeletal copy to Jesus, except Jesus Ben Ananias died right before the Gospel of Mark was written. So, can you name, like, which I don't expect you to have like the Bible memorized or Paul's writings memorized, but can you think of anywhere in Paul where any of that is actually mentioned?
Well, no, I don't think he talks specifically about the crucifixion, doesn't he?
He
Like
just says that he was crucified.
Yeah.
Right. So none of that list that I just read off was mentioned by Paul.
Right.
Right. Okay. So you have Paul writing in the 50s, right? He's talking about this Jesus character who revealed himself through a revelation in Scripture, right? And then you have Jesus Ben Ananias, who does all this shit and dies by the Romans, who kill him and everything. And then Mark writes his gospel that pretty much has all of these things in it. The one difference here is when the Roman governor tries to release him, one is released. That would be Jesus Ben Ananias. Christ isn't, because at that particular part in the story, it's just a rehash of the Yom Kippur ritual in Judaism, where they release one that has the sins of Israel on them, and then they kill the other, right? Blood magic. So my point is that I know that you think that like all of this was just, or well, you think that mythicism says that all of this was just made up out of whole cloth, that people just sat down one day and brainstormed a really good idea, right?
Well, really bad idea, but yeah.
Well, bad idea, good idea, whatever. But what I'm trying to show you here is that you have these Christians who are talking about a Christ, a Jesus that supposedly existed in the 50s. And then you have like, what is it, 20, 30 years later, you have this guy dying, Jesus Ben Ananias, and then Gospels start cropping up. Mark's first, Matthew copies off Mark, Luke copies off Matthew and Mark, John uses Mark and Paul to generate his Gospel. Nowhere in Paul does it actually connect to an earthly Jesus. I know that this is a fundamental thing that we disagree on, but I don't think that there's anything in Paul's writings other than that Jesus supposedly came, he died for the sins of Israel, and then he was resurrected, and he started revealing himself to people, right? That's basically the story that Paul tells, right?
Yeah.
That's all of that you can find in the Old Testament, right? So
I would disagree on that part. I don't think the resurrection is actually in the Old Testament.
It is. I mean, it doesn't specifically say, if I recall correctly, it doesn't specifically say, Jesus Christ will be resurrected and everything. It doesn't specifically say that, but it does have wording and allusions to him resurrecting or being resurrected rather, and absolving the sins of the people. So, like I said, all of Paul's things, they are found in the Old Testament. And regardless of whether or not they were actually like prophecies of the Messiah or actually fulfilled by the Messiah or anything like that, there's still the fact that you have the earliest Christians, Paul and the other sects that were around at the time, were using those scriptures in order to inform themselves about the theology of this new religion of the Messiah, which, if you think about how the word Christianity is constructed, it's actually just a religion about the Messiah of Judaism. It's not actually about the historical figure named Jesus. it's about the Messiah of Judaism.
Well, to go off your example with Jesus Ben what?
Jesus Ben
Something.
Ananias.
Jesus Ben Ananus. Like that part, I think is a good argument. I haven't heard that one before. You take most of the story and just take that part at the end where Jesus was not released and was crucified. That's much more plausible. Where you take a real story like that and add just a little bit on rather than making up the whole story. So that I think is a good argument I haven't heard before.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I'm glad that I could shed some light on this. I mean, I know that we disagree fundamentally on this. I feel that you probably aren't on my side of this at the end of it, but I do like having these conversations. And I'm sorry if I got like condescending at any one particular point. Sometimes I react that way out of habit. So I'm really sorry about that if I did. But
Oh, no problem. I enjoy having these conversations too.
yeah, which I know I still have to watch your Robert Price, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Robert Price. You talked to Robert Price. I'm gonna have to watch that because I really want to see that exchange, which is on your channel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to see that, if you're particularly interested in this kind of conversation, definitely go over there and check out TJump's channel. Watch his discussion with Robert Price. I'm sure that it's awesome. I was really what's the best way to say this? I was really let down by Price's debate with Bart Ehrman. And I know that there were a lot of people that were also let down by it. So I know Price has some really good work, like some good books, in his particular field. But I think that, there are times when it's a little embarrassing, I guess, because I do agree that there are a lot of crank mythicist ideas out there. But I do feel like, because I know that you were concerned about how incredibly implausible things are, like interpolations and adding in text completely to something, but I would say that you have to look at the entire critical context, like around a passage. Like for Tacitus, if you read Robert Van Voorst's Jesus Outside the Bible, you'll see that he covers a lot of the sources outside of the Bible. Most of them are not actually independent sources of Jesus. And wouldn't you agree that independent sources that attest to Jesus are what we're looking for?
Yeah, that would be the best form of evidence.
Okay. So if you guys, sorry, I was about to start the end of the stream. But Tom, do you have anything else like you want to say, or anything you want to leave the audience with, or anything like that?
No, it was a really great conversation. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed talking with you. Check out my channel, and my conversation with Bob Price. I do actually agree with you that I don't think he did well on that debate, but I think that's more because his conversation skills in person aren't as good. He likes to really go detailed into things without making like really concise points, and so it really doesn't come off well in a debate. So.
Yeah, like I said, I really like the books that he has, and I have the Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and he's got a lot of great insight in his books. But I agree, he doesn't really come off so well, I guess, in a live debate setting. But yeah, so thank you so much, Tom, for joining me tonight, especially with the late pushback. I really appreciate you being so flexible. And I guess if you guys haven't yet, if you notice in the description, I have these things called click to tweet links, where you can click to tweet that you support Tom's position in this, that you agreed with everything Tom said, or if you agreed with things that I said. I have click to tweet links in the description to do that. If you want to show, which side of the debate you're on, I would really love to see those on Twitter. So if you could do that, definitely do that. Otherwise, visit all of Tom's links. If you want to join the Skeptic Mafia, or download the Crestus app if you want to support the channel here. And I guess we'll see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and bye, guys.